Paradise from John James Audubon to the Florida Highwaymen. It's presented tonight by Carrie Watson. Carrie is an assistant director of the School of Visual Arts and Design and an associate professor of art history at the University of Central Florida. I moved you just a little further south, I'm sorry. She serves as co-executive editor for Panorama, the Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art, and is the author of A New Deal for Florida, Parks and Post Offices in the Sunshine State, and Visual and Performing Arts Collaborations in Higher Education, Transdisciplinary Practices. Dr. Watson's research has been recognized and supported by a Fulbright Fellowship and grants from the National Endowments of Arts, Arts Midwest, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Society for the Preservation of American Modernists. I'm going to ask that you place yourself on mute. And if you have questions, please enter them in chat or hold them till the end of the program, and we'll make sure that all of your questions are answered. With that, I would like to welcome Carrie Watson. Carrie?
Thank you. Let's see. I am going to share my screen here. And just give me one more second to make sure oops. Oh, I see. Okay, I'm going to stop share for a second because I wanted it to do something else. I don't think it wants to do it the way I want to do it, but that is okay. How to do this. Okay, thank you so much for having me. Let me just, if I can minimize that and maybe this so it's not in my way. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here joining you from, I live in Oviedo, which is near Orlando. I'm a speaker for Florida Humanities, which is the nonprofit statewide partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which provides funding for cultural nonprofits across the state to host exciting and innovative public humanities programming. And I hope you find this talk to be, if not innovative, at least exciting, or one of those two adjectives. Funding for this program was provided by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State Division of Arts and Culture, the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So let's see. So my talk tonight is Picturing Paradise from John James Audubon to the Florida Highwaymen. The Florida landscape has provided aesthetic inspiration to artists for centuries. William Bartram, Titian Ramsay Peale, and John James Audubon came in the 18th century in search of native flora and fauna, followed by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Martin Johnson Head, George Inness, Winslow Homer, and Henry Ossawa Tanner in the 19th century, who were lured by its natural beauty and warm restorative climate. During the 20th century, artists including Earl Cunningham and Emil Holzhauer made Florida their adopted homes, while native Floridians around Fort Pierce, later known as the Florida Highwaymen, earned their livelihoods selling paintings to tourists up and down US 1 and A1A. So tonight, I'm going to show you an overview of some of the artists who have come to Florida or lived in Florida and captured its sublime beauty in paint. And we're also going to talk about American landscape painting in general. Here is a painting I'm showing you on the screen right now by Thomas Cole, who did not paint in Florida, but is kind of the grandfather or father, rather, of the Hudson River School and primary figure in American landscape painting. And really show through this how naturalism and environmentalism work together in painting across the country, but specifically in Florida. So art and the environment do work hand in hand, as art plays a key role in protecting the nation's scenic landscapes. During the 19th century, artists working in the Hudson River Valley created paintings of the region's lakes, rivers, and mountains to help protect and preserve them. And paintings by Albert Bierstadt of Yosemite. Here you see the Valley of Yosemite from 1864, and paintings like this one, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, by Thomas Moran. Both of these paintings helped to establish the National Park Service. And this painting hangs in Congress and was shown before Congress in order to establish Yellowstone as our first national park. But Florida's land and seascapes have provided similar aesthetic inspiration to artists who have also worked for conservation efforts. From the work of William Bartram in the 17th century and Audubon in the 18th, and then here we see Homer in the 19th, to again, those artists working in the 20th and even 21st centuries. Artists have represented the natural landscape, shaping it to suit the needs of contemporary viewers. Studying artist representations of the Florida landscape emphasizes the interconnectedness of nature and culture and asks us to examine how and where art and ecology intersect. So when we travel across Florida from the Panhandle to the Everglades, we encounter a variety of there are sand dunes and swamps and estuaries and bays and rivers and hardwood hammocks, dunes, mangroves, wetlands, scrublands, and all of these are reflected in the painted representations that we find as well. Florida is home to 45 distinct terrestrial ecosystems. We have rolling hills, bluffs, and ravines in the Panhandle, flatwoods, springs, and dome swamps in the central Florida area, and of course, sloughs and sawgrass marshes and dry prairies in South Florida. Florida also has 1,200 miles of coastline with estuaries, seagrass beds, mangrove swamps, coral reefs, as well as freshwater rivers, streams, lakes, and springs, all of which support aquatic communities. And we also have karst landscapes formed by limestone deposits, as we have sinkholes, caves, and springs. The sand ridges in the Central Peninsula around present-day Sebring and Lake Wade, islands surrounded by the sea, which allowed unique species of plants and animals to evolve there. And finally, as I'm sure many of you know, the state's climate varies from temperate in the north to tropical in the south. And this also contributes to the state's distinct geologies and climates, which also support unique ecosystems, which are then inspire artists to create artwork. So among the first of these artists to arrive in Florida was William Bartram. I just drove to Hastings from Oviedo this weekend and passed a sign for the William Bartram Trail. And he explored the American Southeast from 1773 to 1777, recording the region's plants, animals, and native peoples, and publishing his book, Travels Through North and South Carolina, Georgia, East and West Florida, which was published in 1779 in Philadelphia. Both inspired by and diverting from the traditional modes of British scientific illustration, Bartram is well known for his images of alligators. Look a little different than the alligators as we might draw them today, but here are Bartram's alligators. Here is a landscape also with an alligator in one of these kind of sinkhole karst landscapes. Morning glories, we're familiar with these. Also here we see some jays, and this is a vignette scene where he's put various wildlife together, right, with this fish kind of floating over here in space next to a bird and some plants. And then here is also a little landscape that shows the biodiversity and is also rather fanciful. We see the frog being devoured over there by the lizard. We have a hummingbird sitting there with a dragonfly and a lotus, and some snails as well as some water lettuce. So whereas his drawing of the morning glory here is a detailed literal transcription, and it's alone on a plain background. We might compare this to like a pressed flower in a book. This was the natural history convention of the time that had been codified by London's Royal Society. So he did make drawings like this, but his vignettes, as you're seeing here, are a little different. So he plays with the conventions of how to depict the landscape. In Bartram's eyes, spring-fed streams, sandy banks, and ancient trees formed a natural paradise, created compositions that upended convention. So this drawing that was commissioned by Peter Collinson that you see on the right, and Collinson was a London businessman and natural history enthusiast who commissioned this. And so for this, Bartram has depicted the lotuses, each in a different stage of their bud and bloom in a marsh. But he wanted to add a little something to it. So he calls upon the picturesque, which is really just means to make something like a picture, to create a vignette. And he takes this blue heron, which you see here, and adds it to the lower left. But what is so interesting about this is the way that Bartram has translated the scene. So this heron, it comes from Edwards, Heron from North America, a bird book. So really a book that he uses almost as a pattern book. And he picks up this little vignette and drops it down, but he does not adjust the scale, right? So his lotuses are these almost, it's almost like science fiction, right? We have these huge flowers and this little heron. So he's blending two different conventions, the taxonomic of the kind of pressed flower with the picturesque of the vignette, into what Elizabeth Athens of the Worcester Art Museum has called a curious performance. And as Bartram said, quote, "This world, as a glorious apartment of the boundless palace of the sovereign creator, is furnished with an infinite variety of animated scenes, inexpressibly beautiful and pleasing, equally free to the inspection and enjoyment of all his creatures. I attempt only to exhibit to your notice the outward furniture of nature, or the productions of the surface of the earth, without troubling you with any notions of their particular causes or design by Providence. Such attempts I leave for the amusement of men of letters and superior genius." Close quote. But nature's variety inspired Bartram, and his drawings and records introduced readers on both sides of the Atlantic to Florida. And in fact, Bartram's book was better read in Europe than it was in the colonies, and was translated into almost every major European language. Although he also documented his travels in South Carolina and Georgia, he's really best remembered for his drawings and descriptions of Florida. And his depiction of the Alachua Savannah, which you see here, were even used to conserve lands that today comprise Paynes Prairie Preserve State Park near Gainesville. The British poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were inspired by Bartram's imagery, and the Romantic movement owed much to the sights, sounds, and fragrances of Florida as described by Bartram. His observations encouraged other naturalists to visit Florida, notably Titian Ramsay Peale, who by the age of 24 had established himself as the foremost bird illustrator in the United States, traveled up the St. Johns River in 1817, and made this lovely painting of sandhill cranes in 1822, although his efforts to collect specimens were thwarted by the First Seminole War. Peale's chief rival was not deterred by war. John James Audubon made 2 visits to Florida. He first visited St. Augustine in the fall of 1831 to collect water birds for the 3rd volume of Birds of America, and he returned in the spring of 1832 and visited the Keys. On these trips, he recorded 52 new ornithological species, including the Florida cormorant, which you see here, the Florida jay, and also the very popular flamingo. And here's also his illustration of mockingbirds, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But Audubon illustrated birds of America. I'm showing it here for you with a person so you get a sense of just how large this book is. It's the largest bird book ever published, both in physical size. Its pages measure almost 40 inches by 26 inches, but also in the number of birds illustrated, which was 1,037. This book was issued in 87 parts between 1827 and 1838, and it contained an engraved title page and 435 aquatinta plates. In contrast to Bartram, Audubon insisted on portraying the birds at life size, which is why we have such a huge book. And he emphasized behavior and environment. And in fact, by doing this, he really changed the way that birds were illustrated. Typically, ornithologists would kill the birds and then have them taxidermed. So they were, stuffed. And then they would draw the birds. But Audubon didn't have them taxidermied first. He would draw his birds while they were still fresh from the kill. So he would kill them and then he would use wires and rig them up into these kind of lifelike positions. And he also, like Bartram, broke with the norms of scientific illustration. And this is an example of that. Instead of just giving us some mockingbirds, he gives us a mockingbirds as their nest is being attacked by this rattlesnake. And they're almost human-like in the expressions that they make. The jaw of the rattlesnake is open, the mockingbirds are trying to attack it. We see this one trying to peck out its eyes, right, to get it away from presumably the eggs in the nest that it's already eaten. And so he's really merging art and science, and like Bartram, sometimes sacrificing accuracy to aesthetics. But of course, Audubon is an incredibly important figure in American ornithology, much to Peale's chagrin, I should say. Peale did not like all of the innovations that Audubon was doing and often tried to discredit Audubon. And Titian Ramsay Peale, of course, is the son of Charles Wilson Peale, very famous and important American artist who opened the first museum in the United States, moved from Baltimore to Philadelphia, named all of his children after famous artists of the Renaissance, a very elite family. And so it is interesting now, though, that perhaps, I'm sure many of you know the name Audubon, but maybe you do not know the name Titian Ramsay Peale. The legacy of Audubon lives on as he helped to raise awareness about America's native bird population. He helped to save species that were rapidly disappearing due to overhunting. Not that he didn't kill plenty of birds himself, but still he inspired the saving of birds, so much so that, of course, the National Audubon Society is named for him. Okay, so American illustrators working in Florida, though we could probably say, emphasize the environment by placing their subjects, in this case, birds and flowers, into picturesque vignettes. And we can see then a move to these vignettes and the picturesque to what will become landscape paintings in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, landscape does emerge as a distinctly American art form that was influenced by both Dutch and British landscapes, as well as Romanticism and the Enlightenment. American landscape painting in the 19th century will supplant portraiture as the most popular genre of art. And the landscape painting is very much imbued with allegorical and religious and scientific and even imperial significance as idealized images of vast, unspoiled wilderness reflect a nation whose identity was increasingly interwoven with its natural environment. Of course, we don't have medieval castles and cathedrals in the United States, but we do have the Grand Canyon, and we have Niagara Falls, and we have these amazing cathedrals of nature, they're sometimes called. And architectural and topographical views would record land development, property ownership, colonization. People looked to nature's spacious skies and purple mountain majesties. And landscape paintings, both large and small, could offer artists powerful ways to envision the natural world, convey spirituality, and display economic capital. Landscapes could also offer scenes of an imagined peaceful future. And this was a prospect which was particularly appealing to a nation engaged in numerous military conflicts over the course of the 19th century. So after the Civil War, abolitionists, including William Cullen Bryant and Harriet Beecher Stowe, as well as Henry Ossawa Tanner, all moved to Florida. And as the nation industrialized, Florida's unspoiled nature became a visual tonic to ease the strains of modern life. So here we see paintings by Stowe and Tanner on the screen, offering pleasant scenes of kind of life in Florida. Or I'm sorry, here you just see Stowe. So she moved to Florida and bought a house and grew oranges, and she encouraged her friend Tanner to move here as well. And he painted this painting of an orange grove in '94. He doesn't stay in Florida. He will move to Europe and live out the rest of his life on the continent. But he did have a sojourn here in Florida as well. Henry Flagler famously was so taken by the potential of Florida to what he called to become what he called an American Riviera, that in the winter of 1883, he began construction on the Hotel Ponce de Leon, which you're seeing here, now Flagler College. And he included studios for artists in the northernmost building of the hotel complex. The hotel actually housed 7 salons for visiting artists, and a gallery ran along the north side of the building where artists would host receptions in their studios on Friday nights, and guests and patrons could admire their work and hopefully maybe even buy some. Many Northerners were drawn to the state, and they commissioned landscape paintings. And we see then the sensibilities of the Hudson River School, the tonalists, and the impressionists all reflected in the paintings that are made of Florida. So for instance, in 1886, Flagler commissioned Martin Johnson Head, who was one of the first of 2 artists to take up residency in the hotel. In fact, he lived in the coveted studio number 7, which overlooked the West Lawn. And Flagler commissioned him to create 2 paintings to decorate the hotel's rotunda. The first is this, the Great Florida Landscape of the Great Florida Sunset of 1887, and it has a pendant piece that's a little bit smaller, view from Fern Tree Walk, Jamaica. These paintings were meant to be viewed together, and they blend the motifs of the Hudson River School with the aesthetic interests of Impressionism to encompass the values of nationalism, Reconstruction, and expansionism. As shifting fashions and ideologies led to the development of various stylistic innovations, 3 key tropes of Romanticism, the pastoral, the picturesque, and the sublime, will govern American landscape painting in the 19th century. The pastoral and picturesque represent nature as safe and comforting and spiritually imbued, while the sublime is more about kind of danger, but it's really embodied also in forests and swamps and waterfalls, canyons, mountains. In this formulation, nature is maybe overwhelming or thrilling or transcendent. And we see these motifs kind of blended in 19th century American landscape painting. And each of these modes is found in Florida's landscape paintings. They reflect both the individual ideologies of the artists as well as the patrons, as well as the changing ideas of the times. So the Great Florida Sunset, which you see here, is a wide canvas, a panoramic canvas that presents viewers with a nice view of the St. Johns River. It's surrounded by oak hammocks and scrub pines, punctuated by palm trees. The river is cast in this beautiful orange glow of the sunset. And this painting really becomes a precedent for thousands of Florida landscapes that follow, including Heed's own Florida river scene, which you see here. And if any of you, I'm sure many of you, all of us, have made drives in Florida where we look over, and this is what we see, and it is a beautiful view. I know I lived in New York. I taught at Ithaca College for a year, and when I'm from Florida, when we came back to Florida, I was so happy to have the sunsets back. They really are beautiful, and Heed captures them marvelously. Beginning in the 1890s, the hotel became the centerpiece of the St. Augustine artist colony, and inaugurated a great tradition of artist colonies in Florida, often traveling as advisors to business interests. Artists were commissioned to paint Florida's salt marshes and palm trees, newly planted citrus groves, and coastal wetlands. And the contrast of deep shadows and bright light created by the contrast we have in the natural environment of bright sunlight and humidity with oak hammocks and swamps and marshes, as well as those dramatic sunrises and sunsets, really fascinated artists and tapped into that interest in late 19th century landscape painting. In 1877, George Ennis began wintering in Tarpon Springs. He was a master of light, tone, and shadow, and is known to be someone who was a Hudson River School painter, but then moves into a movement called tonalism. And he created these complex scenes that juxtapose hazy elements with more sharper and refined details. And really, tonalism is a reflection as well of the scientific discoveries and research into vision and the way in which the human eye focuses and perceives light. Like others who moved to the country to escape city life, Ennis moved to Tarpon Springs in 1877. And he also created this scene of a moonrise near his home. And his use of light evokes palpable atmospheric effects, but they're also a little sad, perhaps, a little melancholy. And Ennis was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Swedish Lutheran theologian, scientist, philosopher, and mystic, who was a big influence on the 19th century American spiritualist movement. We have quite a few spiritualist communities in Florida, and spiritualism, or the belief that the dead communicate with the living, was popular in the United States and Europe from the mid to late 19th century. It was closely tied also to the women's suffrage movement, to abolition, and to early naturalism. Many gravitated towards spiritualism because it reconciled new scientific discoveries with religion and seemed to provide proof of the divine through seances and spirit photographs that offered audible and visible evidence of an afterlife. Spiritualists also rebelled against traditional religious authority and emphasized radical individualism. And so Ennis is a Swedenborgian. He is influenced by this movement. Excuse me, he's influenced by this, and we can kind of see this interest in maybe the spiritual or the divine in his landscape. Other artists painted Florida as well. William Morris Hunt visited the Florida swamps, and here we see Governor's Creek, Florida. We also have Thomas Moran, who I showed you earlier, of course, the famous Yellowstone painting, but he came to the state to create this work, Ponce de Leon in Florida. This is a historiated landscape, meaning it is a landscape painting, but it also has this kind of mini historical vignette going on in it. He wanted to sell this to the U.S. House of Representatives. He thought it would be nice hanging behind the speaker's chair, but instead it was purchased by Flagler. So we see Flagler as really wanting to keep a lot of these paintings of Florida to himself. And I showed you a Woodward a moment ago. I'm going to talk to you for a minute here about Laura Woodward. She had exhibited with the Hudson River School artists, but she began wintering in St. Augustine in the 1880s. And she painted the Anastasia Island Lighthouse, which you see here. And she traveled throughout the state, down to Palm Beach and Jupiter, down by you, looking for tropical plants and exotic scenery to include in her paintings. She exhibited her resulting paintings. There's a view of Lake Worth, and we have these beautiful trees as well, poincianas, and the mouth of Miami River here. But she was so popular with Flagler that when he developed South Florida and built the railroad down the coast, and built the Hotel Royal Poinciana in Palm Beach in 1893, he built a studio just for her, a permanent residence for her to live and work from. And she did. She worked there out of that studio, publicizing the beauty of South Florida until failing eyesight forced her to give up painting in 1920. In 1895, she traveled down to Miami to make this painting. This Fort Dallas was a U.S. military installation during the Seminole Wars, which were the largest wars against Native Americans fought in the country. Let's see. And we see here the water, the majestic palms rising over this horizon line. And I think you can see that this is more impressionistic. Her brushwork, this kind of tosh, small brushwork really enhances the fleeting nature of the moment. We get the sense of the water moving in front of us. But the most famous artist, oh, that doesn't look very good. But we'll go to this next one. Most famous artist to paint Florida's scenery was Winslow Homer, who made 6 trips to Florida in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He made his first trip in the winter of '85. He really enjoyed the warmer climate, and he loved to fish. He was a sportsman, so he enjoyed that. He would travel by steamer from Maine to New York to Florida. And he would also go down to the Caribbean. And his favorite Florida locations included Jacksonville, Enterprise, Homosassa, Tampa, and Key West. And he painted this, one of his most powerful works, the Gulf Stream, in 1899. Here we see a solitary Black sailor in a small disabled boat. He appears overwhelmed by these sharks in the foreground. He's alone and adrift on a rather turbulent sea. There's a strong sense of diagonal in the waves and in the boat's positioning, which also creates a sense of movement and instability, which intensifies the feelings of unease and danger, the sublime of the ocean, right? Of the power of the Gulf Stream that can capture you and take you wherever it wants to go. We have a dark, stormy sky. We have the name for that is escaping me. The water spout coming up there. And then if you look closely on the far left, you see a ship there on the distance balancing that water spout. But our poor man here is adrift looking the opposite way. And so there's this sense of tension that would he discover the boat? Would the boat discover him? Would he be saved? Or would he be lost to these sharks? So there's an open-ended narrative here that allows for multiple interpretations. And some have seen this painting as a commentary on human struggle for survival. Others have seen it as a reflection on the African diaspora and the Middle Passage, the journey on the slave ships across the Atlantic. The absence of any immediate rescue or resolution leaves us feeling uncertain. Very powerful and thought-provoking work that asks us to engage with questions of human resilience and vulnerability, and also the power of nature. So in addition to oil paintings, Homer created many watercolors while he was in Florida and in the tropics, all of which were well received. This is Key West Hauling Anchor, which is, I think, beautiful, one of my favorite paintings. my husband's aunt has a house in Jupiter, and that she has a print of this hanging on the wall. And I really enjoy looking at this, even in reproduction. But he also took a great many photographs when he was in the St. Johns River. Here's an example of a photograph that he took, and he painted also at least 11 watercolors during his stay of approximately a month in Homosassa. He wrote to his brother saying, "Delightful climate here, about as cool as our September. Fishing the best in America as far as I can find." And so we often see paintings with people fishing in them. The Homosassa Springs Wildlife State Park has a permanent exhibit of Homer's watercolors of the Homosassa River. And Homer once said, "You will see in the future, I will live by my watercolors." And that prophecy really came true, as today Winslow Homer is considered a master of watercolor and a great painter of the sea. And here is another watercolor in the jungle, and here we see the Florida panther. Okay. So following Homer, many artists moved to Florida in search of warm weather and scenic landscapes during the 1920s land boom. And since then, Florida has attracted numerous artists interested in capturing the tranquility of its beaches, oak hammocks, and cypress swamps. Compared to the Northeast and Midwest, Florida appeared wild, a feature capitalized upon by Earl Cunningham, a self-taught artist, also from Maine, like Homer, who painted mostly landscapes of the coasts of Maine, New York, Nova Scotia, Michigan, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Florida. And sometimes he mixes the locales into one. They're kind of fanciful paintings. He used very vivid colors and flat perspectives. He moved to St. Augustine in 1949 and opened an art gallery there. And in 1961, he sent this painting titled "The Everglades" to Jackie Kennedy. And now today, this painting is on display in the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston. Around the same time, another largely self-taught artist and Florida native, here's one more, Cunningham, Seminole Everglades. And you can see the flamingos and the birds and this kind of fanciful cypress swamp scene he has here. But around the same time as Cunningham is working, we have another largely self-taught Florida native working in the Fort Pierce area. Albert E. Beanie Bacchus was influenced by Claude Monet and the Impressionists and created paintings with these dazzling light effects. Although in the last 30 years of his life, his landscapes become a bit more naturalistic, a little bit less impressionistic, more representational. And his success in capturing Florida's beauty was inspired by his scientific study of plants, wildlife, and even meteorology. And into his 80s, he could be seen around Fort Pierce studying and sketching the nuances of light and plants, the effect of lights at sunrise on plants and on the atmosphere. So he is a landscape painter in his own right, but he is perhaps best remembered for his influence on a group of 26 self-taught African-American landscape painters who began making and selling quick renditions of the Florida landscape. For over 30 years, these men, later named the Florida Highwaymen by gallery owner Jim Fitch, created over 200,000 paintings between the mid-1950s and 1980s. And still painting today, primarily from the Fort Pierce area, painters including Harold Newton. So a couple here for you. This one is actually in the Smithsonian. Alfred Hare, show you a few of his paintings. And Sam Newton. I'm not going to show you 3 of all 26, but I'll just to give you a sense, and then we'll go into some in more detail. Also, Willie C. Reagan, you see here, and Livingston Roberts. Each created idyllic images of Florida's untouched marshes, swamps, and wetlands, and then traveled up and down the highway in search of buyers. Hare developed a rapid style of painting, assembly line style, that allowed him to create paintings very quickly. And other artists associated with the movement also did this. And here's a photograph of Al Black using this technique. So he's set up multiple paintings. Sometimes it would be kind of like on a fence or connected to fence posts, as you can see a little bit here, and you can go through and paint multiple paintings at a time. These so-called highwaymen navigated the racism of the Jim Crow South to make a living selling their paintings door to door and out of the trunks of their cars, sometimes while the paint was still wet. And at the same time, at the time, the paintings cost tourists anywhere between $5 and $35. But today, these same paintings are valued anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000. Let's see. Curtis Arnett was a young boy when he met Alfred Hare while he was giving a painting demonstration at Lincoln Academy. And when Arnett was 12, he happened upon Bacchus when he was riding his bike out to the Indian River to go fishing. And Bacchus gave him 2 brushes, a palette knife, and some tubes of paint. And Arnett went home and started painting on plywood. He connected with the other highwayman painters and continued to develop his style. And at 16 years old, he sold his first painting. And by the time he was 17, he was selling his paintings for $25 each. So another highwayman painter is Robert L. Lewis. He's from Cocoa. He was inspired by Harold Newton while he was in high school. He was encouraged by a family friend to pursue art in college and got his degree in art education from Florida A&M, FAMU in Tallahassee in 1966. And then he taught art in Brevard County for 32 years before being inducted into the Florida Artists Hall of Fame in 2004. The growth of the highwaymen also coincided with a huge population boom in Florida that occurred with the birth of the space program starting in the 1950s, as thousands of people were moving to the Central Florida coast, the Space Coast, and constructions of new homes and businesses were at an all-time high. So many people bought these paintings to decorate their new houses. So we're lucky that, many people did move here and buy these paintings, and there was a large demand for them because they are very popular and very beautiful scenes of the Florida landscape. Here's the St. Lucie wetland, also by Lewis. So looking at some of Brevard County. And here's a painting by Al Black. I showed you a photograph of him earlier. And so in addition to paintings decorating people's living rooms, there are nearly 100 murals painted in Florida's state prisons, thanks to Al Black. And here is one actually right back here. This is a class I teach, and this is the room we teach in. You can see a mural out the door to the left there, as well as right behind us. And these are my students. And Al Black was incarcerated in Florida a few times in different facilities, and he painted murals while he was there. And so we are very lucky as well to have murals in several of our state prisons. Okay, other artists also retired to Florida. Emil Holzhauer, who was born in Germany, moved to New York in 1906, where he studied with Robert Henry, the leader of the Ashcan artists. He went on to teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, and became identified with the American scene movement in the 1930s. In 1953, he retired to Niceville, Florida on the Panhandle, where he continued to paint the landscape. This is a painting there of the Florida coast. I want to show you this painting of the Destin Bridge from 1962. And I'd like to compare it for you to this photograph from 1959 of a similar, the Destin Bridge is here. And here we have Destin. And then, so you can see his fidelity to nature. The Destin Bridge crosses the Choctawhatchee Bay, which is here, and this is Destin Harbor and the East Pass. and this bridge connects Destin to Okaloosa Island. And I think you can see his kind of fidelity here to nature. And then if we compare this, similarly, I think to looking at Bartram and then the Prairie Preserve, here is Destin. And this isn't even today, this is 2013, but very different view. And we can see the level of development and the changing Florida landscape by even looking at Holzhauer's paintings and many of the landscape paintings. In some cases, the landscape looks the same, as I mentioned earlier, with some of those Heed paintings of the palm trees, the St. Johns River. You can still drive and capture vistas like that, but in other cases, it's very different. So I'm going to conclude briefly by a discussion of an artist that many of you may be familiar with, not a painter, but a photographer and conservationist who's very popular, I think, Clyde Butcher, who's a strong advocate of environmental conservation. Let's see, he had an architecture degree, but when he was visiting Yosemite, again, Yosemite, in 1963, he learned about the work of Ansel Adams. And he began making his own photographs of the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Northwest in 1970. But in 1983, he moved to Florida, and his love for the Everglades inspired him to work for its restoration and preservation. In 1993, he bought 14 acres in the Big Cypress National Preserve in South Florida, where he built his gallery and home. And the preserve is surrounded by over 1 million acres of wilderness, which he, for years, photographed with his large format camera. I think that's gotten too big for him, and now he started using smaller digital cameras, but this is some of his earlier work. So I'm going to show you, just to finish, I'm going to finish with this photograph of Indian Pass and read to you what Butcher has said, echoing, I think, the sentiments of William Bartram, written 200 years earlier. At the southwest edge of the Everglades lies one of the world's most productive and biodiverse estuaries, the 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge. This coastal wetland, spanning 35,000 acres, is a labyrinth of mangrove islands. Mangroves contribute to a rich source of nutrition in the form of leaves, bark, and twigs, debris that becomes colonized by microorganisms and eaten by small fish, shrimp, crabs, and their larvae. The plant's ability to trap and accumulate debris creates new islands and habitats for other vegetation, allowing juvenile creatures to flourish. The mangroves, with their sprawling, submersible root structures, offer a hiding place to a diverse array of inhabitants from both larger predators and the pounding destructive forces of seasonal storms. These sturdy barriers are essential in protecting the coastline from tidal surges and pounding waves as hurricanes and tropical storms roll through. The only way you're going to save things in life is through love, and that's what we're trying to do. Make people fall in love with Florida. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carrie. That was wonderful. What glorious, glorious pictures. Does anyone have questions for Carrie? Please go ahead and unmute yourself. Or go ahead and enter your questions in chat.
I do not have a question, but I have a rumor, and maybe she can validate. Okay, so Al Black,
yes,
supposedly paints 3 birds in every picture that he except for when he was in prison.
Well, those murals have 3 too, and my understanding is it's the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that there's always 3 birds.
Okay,
that's what I've heard.
Okay, but I like I said, I heard that only in prison he did not do that, and I don't know if he was able to do paint in, not the murals, but paintings in prison. Is that a possibility?
Well, so the mural in that classroom where I taught does have 3 birds because we talked about it in my class when I was teaching. I don't know if there's other examples. I haven't seen all 100. I haven't, they're not, so there's that picture is from the Central Florida Reception Center, which is here in Orlando. But there are some in other prisons, and I haven't seen all of his murals. To my knowledge, he did not also paint like on canvases while he was incarcerated. He was just allowed to paint on the walls. Kind of depends. So we have taught painting classes through the Florida Prison Education Project at that same prison, in that same room, actually. But I don't know if when he was incarcerated, I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, maybe 90s, early aughts. I'm not sure if they were having any painting classes or if he was only allowed to paint on the walls.
Okay, fair enough. Like I said, it was a rumor I heard. So thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. I typed in the chat box, but I guess it got
Okay.
buried. I had asked how many artists number were considered highwaymen. Someone typed in,
26.
someone typed in 26. But the other part of my question was repeat the number of paintings that they created.
Oh dear.
Well,
you had given
they say some 200,000,
200,000.
but I would also say that,
That's a low number.
right, because that I think that's counting like between the 50s and the 80s. Right? And then there's now many more that have been made since then.
And
Wow,
there's
that's
still-
a lot of paintings out there.
Yeah, a lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Nora, are we missing anything else in chat?
Yeah, another one of the questions in the chat was from Dan. There's not many magnolia trees in Florida, and the ones that he painted lots of them. Do you know where they were painted?
I'm sorry, not many what? I didn't understand what you said.
Magnolia flowers.
Oh, magnolias? You're
Mhm.
saying did I show some magnolias? You're saying there's not a lot of magnolias in Florida? There's a lot in
Not
my
in this
neighborhood.
not in this part.
Maybe they don't grow in South Florida. They grow in Central and North Florida. And it depends if you look at like how the highway department of, like where's the line for South Florida, right? So the Fort Pierce area sometimes is called Central Florida and sometimes it's called South Florida. But if you're looking at are you looking at how do you do the regions by like development, by plants, by the the Köppen climate thing? But I'm not sure which artist made the magnolia painting. That I can't think of one that had magnolias in it, but maybe it's just escaping me. I guess I could look at my PowerPoint real quick and see if I can find a magnolia.
Heed. Heade.
Yeah, I'm almost to Heed. I've just gone through Homer. I'm looking. I'm almost there. But I don't see a magnolia in the three Heeds. Sorry. The Great
No,
Florida
that's
that has palm trees. I think that's more like the St. John's River. He probably painted it near St. Augustine. Definitely looks like the St. John's River. And then the Jamaica Fern Walk is Jamaica. Heed also is famous for going to South America and the islands and painting hummingbirds. You may have seen some of those. That has an oak and some ferns in it. And then the other one has palm trees. I do love magnolias. But I don't think there's any magnolias in this presentation.
And there's one more question. Why do you think Flagler wanted to keep paintings to himself versus allow them to leave Florida to advertise Florida and his properties or railroad?
Oh, well, I assume he probably wanted the Thomas Moran one that has Ponce de Leon in it because that was the name of his hotel. So he thought it would be appropriate there. I think that other ones, he wanted the people who came to stay at the hotel to buy paintings and business interests. I mean, he certainly wanted anything to promote the state. I think he probably just wanted that one for his hotel because it had the subject and the name.
How large were these canvases that Black did?
The highwaymen,
Yes.
the well, the ones in the prison are really big, but most of them are kind of normal kind of size, maybe a little bit bigger than that. The Castro Roberts I showed, we have that. It's in we own it at UCF, and it's probably 4.5 feet wide and about 3 feet tall.
And the
But
ones
like
that
that Thomas Moran are huge. They're like 12 feet wide.
oh, okay. Thanks.
You're welcome.
We here in Florida love the highwaymen pictures, but I'm wondering, from your perspective as an art historian, how does the quality of the artwork hold up against those other Florida artists you came across? I mean, if they're producing them in one big long line of paintings, I'm just wondering how they're valued artistically.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And it goes back a ways. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about Leonardo da Vinci painting The Last Supper. So the head of the monastery kept coming in, and he would see Leonardo just sitting there staring at the wall. And finally he said, "We're not paying you to just sit there. Why aren't you painting?" And then once he did start painting, it didn't take too long, right? Because he was thinking, he was coming up with his idea. And so some people paint quickly, some people paint slowly. I think right now, from like a valuation standpoint, the paintings that were sold that are older, right? The 50s to maybe the early 80s are more valuable, but partially that has to do with because of the story, right? So arguably it was harder for these men to and one woman to make their living selling these paintings during that time period, maybe than it is now. Although, as you said, they're very popular, right? So and then the more there are, so the more that are created, then the kind of less valuable, right? Because market saturation, right? Like supply and demand. So if there's only 200,000, that's still tons, but those 200,000 are more valuable than if now you have like 1 million, right? And so then the first generation ones are going to be more valuable. The ones that are made by people who are no longer alive are more valuable than people who are still alive and still painting. Now, that was a market valuation. I think you were asking about a quality kind of evaluation as well, and aesthetics, which goes a little bit back to my Leonardo da Vinci, I suppose, because we could argue that the quality of The Last Supper is not good at all as well, right? Because he experimented and it is didn't go so well, and it hasn't held up at all. So that's interesting, I think, as well. And we have now we're seeing even the High Museum has done a reinstallation. And if you're familiar with like Howard Finster and outsider artists or self-taught artists, that work was often kind of over by its side, but now there's a real movement in museum installation to exhibit the self-taught art with the professional artists, and to not really make this distinction, but to talk about trends in modernism, to not separate quote unquote art from quote unquote craft. All of this art kind of tells us something about a story about life. In this case, of course, there's lots of issues of like race and class that are tied into the Highwayman paintings as well, right? Which can increase or decrease the valuation depending on kind of the moment in time, right? When Michelle Obama buys a Highwayman painting, that makes them more valuable. When the Smithsonian puts one into the collection, I don't, when Earl Cunningham, he wasn't a Highwayman painter, but just as another example of, sends his painting to Jacqueline Kennedy, right? That adds this kind of prestige to it. So I know I wandered all around your question without really answering it very precisely, but I think that's because you know, quality is challenging. Like we have a Thomas Hart Benton in the collection at UCF, but it is not like his best painting, right? And how do we decide that? I think it was very innovative, what they came up with, and I certainly love to look at them, the landscape paintings. So that was my answer, non-answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Does
It's art-
anyone
art
else?
is in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. If you like it, then it's valuable. And these certainly are valuable, though, also on the market, right? I mean, we've just had an exhibit at the Orlando Museum and the Tampa Museum, in addition to all of the smaller exhibits. And I think if there was a Highwayman show, at other institutions as well, that sometimes these things are, they become something because people write about them. So we probably need more people to write about the Highwaymen, more people to write articles and books about them to get more people involved. But they're, I love them. And I love that people love them so much too, right? It's great.
Thank you, Carrie. Does anyone else have more questions?